Salvi's Search for the Universe. Chapter 13. His ankles clicked and cracked. They were both broken, but no bones protruded, and neither was there any pain. He jabbed another stinger into his side and squeezed. His vision blurred, and colors were swirling, twisting and curling. His veins felt more drug than blood, but it was the only thing keeping him moving forwards. The ground swayed like oceans, and his ears would not stop ringing. It had taken him far too long to escape. He had heard rumors, but it was the first time he had experienced the brilliance of kobold trap-making firsthand. The failure was all his own. He should have known a kobold would resort to something so underhanded. The trap had somehow bound both his arms and feet as it slung him over the branch of a tall tree. At first he had tried to cut the naturally woven cord with one of his many knives around his belt, but the motion had simply caused them all to slip from his waist and onto the forest floor below. After that, his only choice had been to rely upon the strength of his abdominals, and fold himself upwards, and chew at the cord fibre by fibre. It was much sturdier than he had imagined. Gathering enough strength on top of his already battered body had taken several periods of resting and strain that spanned days. The constant flailing and straining is what eventually broke his ankles, and with no access to his narcotics, had been forced to bear the pain naturally. It was the fall that did the most damage. He felt no hunger nor thirst, but his body was starving, and he had stopped sweating some time ago. He stuffed his hand into his pocket and pulled out a nugget of glass. The glass glowed a warm orange, like that of the setting sun, spilling and pooling towards the tip. He followed it for a while longer, stopped, examined the open field, and waved the glass in the air. He could easily evade the two archers hidden in the trees, even in his current condition. He had already done that once already. Before he joined the group, one of his previous employers had hired him to assassinate the group leader, Egatorn. It was one of the most difficult jobs he had ever done, and was so filled with respect for the organization that he accepted Egatorn's offer immediately, with their knives at each other's throat, and assassinated his previous employer. But now was not the time to prove himself to those greenhorns. No arrows nor poison darts were sent his way, so they had recognized him. He followed the liquid light and made his way down an old, overgrown sinkhole. Halfway down his loamy descent, the walls shifted from dirt to something not quite stone. Floating orbs of light lit the shady corridor. A small golem walked past his feet. The lights, the locator, the golems. It was only natural that multinational assassins, whose employers ranged from some of the most powerful individuals on the planet, should have the best toys. The golem and locators were secrets to their success. They could move quick and set up anywhere without the risk of informing their members. The golems had built this temporary base in less than a week. It was situated strategically outside Panas, 2 days of walking away. It was situated perfectly for this assignment. Ordinarily, one job wouldn't necessitate the relocation of their entire base of operation, but this was somehow a special case. Though he himself was not privy to the details, and Egatorn was taking it very seriously. He felt a pang, a twinge at the thought of his failure, for that was what it was. He had failed, and he would need to confront that today. He stepped into the camp proper, several feet below the surface, cool and damp like the soil itself. 2 servants dressed in black ushered him in with silent gestures that flowed like silk. He did not know what Egatorn had done to make these men so servile, but he had a hunch it involved drugs and adolescent castration. The complex was empty, save for the servants and a handful of golems roaming about. All members had already been dispatched, and all that remained of the group was the boss and the 2 guards situated outside. The servants led him through the not quite wooden door into an office. Sitting behind the desk was the back of Egatorn, their leader. Magical lights filled the room with a cyan hue. He was reading something. White eyes. Egatorn did not even need to look. He snapped the book shut and turned around to see the assassin's prostrating figure. He frowned. I failed, the assassin rasped. Egatorn started expressionlessly. It was impossible to tell what thoughts hid behind that mask of a face. His face was so utterly plain and unremarkable, it was almost impossible to recall any of it in great detail, and if not for the long scar spanning his throat, he would be impossible to pick out in any situation. You failed? He tapped his shin pensively as he examined the wounds all over the assassin's ragged body. Yes. Egatorn leaned back and blew out his lips. That was the last thing I expected to hear from you. He spread his palms onto his desk. What is the situation? His voice was level. The assassin peeled his forehead off the floor and looked in shock.
Master? Did you think I would be upset with you? You are the best assassin the organization has. If you failed, there is no sense in dwelling on it. Instead, it speaks to the skill of our opponents.
He shrugged humorlessly, as if it were no more consequence than a broken plate or a tattered shirt.
Sasak, Decker,
he called to his servants.
Tend to his wounds.
The two bowed and left to gather medical equipment.
Now, tell me all about it.
The assassin was surprised, but he felt he shouldn't have been. Egerton lived as if it were no more important than a game of cards. He does his best to win while he's playing, but would not lament the end of the game. It was that strangely capricious charisma that had convinced the spider of Tajatal to join all those years ago. The servants came in with an assortment of tools and remedies.
My attack on Farrell's castle. Everything was going to plan, but the pendant had been hidden skillfully.
They stripped off his clothes and began palpating his swollen, discolored skin.
As I searched, I detected someone who was unthinkably not unconscious from the gas and attacked from the shadows. It was shocking. But I had foreseen my attack and dodged it. The intruder was a kobold. Upon seeing me, it realized it could not defeat me in combat, and instead attempted to masquerade as someone from my own organization in order to deceive me.
He could not grind his forehead into the dirt as the servants held him steady and applied noxious poultices to his battered body.
And it worked.
He groaned.
It worked. They deceived me.
Egerton leaned forward, a tinge of emotion coming across his face.
And how did it deceive you?
His words were sharp.
They found a pendant before me. They handed it to me without struggle, as if it were their job to do so, Master. I could not imagine. I knew they could not defeat me, and I let my guard down. When I attempted to assassinate the Lord, they dropped the chandelier on my back and stole the pendant back as I was unconscious. I have no excuses. No excuses.
You failed to assassinate the Lord as well?
That is...
He chuckled disconcertingly.
That is well below my expectations.
There was a stint of silence. Another servant walked in, carrying a book and a goblet of what was likely wine. They set it on a desk and bowed. Egerton picked up the book, flipped it over, and hurled it at the servant in a fit of rage. The corner of the book had dug into the servant's skull and knocked him backwards, blood flowing from the wound.
Jorval Arkins! You expect me to read Jorval Bloody Arkins? He makes Sam Rabba sound like Rammel Hitchens. It's not fit to wipe my arse with.
The servant expressed no emotion, but bowed remorsefully as blood trickled down his neck.
Burn that, and get me something worthwhile.
He turned his gaze to Assassin.
And you limp back here like a wounded fox? No. I pursued them and located their camp some days outside Herming. And when I went to attack, they seemed to have anticipated my approach. Get on with it.
Egerton sighed, resigned to be utterly disappointed.
I fell into their trap, Master. Their trap? An ambush? A snare trap.
Egerton looked down at the assassin with half-lidded eyes, then clasped and spread his hands.
Well, if it was you failing, I'm sure it could not have been as embarrassing as it sounds. Yes, that's right, isn't it? Yes, they are without doubt the most skilled adversaries I have faced in quite some time. Yes. I'm sure they were dreadfully skilled.
He flapped his hands, and it was difficult to tell if he was being sarcastic or serious.
But what do you have for me? I know the employer and their destination.
Egerton dragged down his wine, as if to say, "Get on with it."
The snake's employer is the Canehorn family. They were camped together with the young heir of House Canehorn on their way to Panes. Yes.
Egerton scratched his short whiskers.
I recall some information claiming that I had gone missing some time ago. So this is what he has been up to.
He chuckled.
Interesting. Yes.
His bones cracked as the servants contorted his limbs.
Give me 3 days, 2 to recuperate, and I will. No.
He reached into his drawer and pulled out an intricate stone carving. The stone in the assassin's pocket grew hot.
This is far too important to leave in the hands of one failure. For this, it's time we called everyone back.
Salvi's pace was steady and bright, as if marching to the beat of her own heart. The forests were twisting and treacherous, the underlying path impassable for any vehicle larger than small, two-wheeled carts. The landscape was much like a basin, and the ground was left rocky as millennia of rain washed the soil further down the valley and into the lake at the bottom. The silty soil was so poor that even the vast meadows that would have been claimed centuries ago by entrepreneuring farmers everywhere else were left entirely untouched. The only claim to fame the region had was that its climate and altitude was perfect for one species of moss that was good for treating ailing livestock. Though there were farms, she had seen them, so few and far between on shallow islands of fertile land that dotted the landscape like spots on a painter's gown. Were walking into town to get your scythe repaired at a local blacksmith was an all-day affair. But Salvi was not concerned with any of that. She had seen a farm or two, so she was certain she must be near the town. And she was right. It appeared over the horizon. She walked nearer and yelped as the whizzing burr flew towards her. She froze as the arrow quivered between her legs. She threw up her hands and considered running away in that instant. Across the distance she could see stern-faced humans huddled behind some kind of barricade, and a town beyond. It was frighteningly small. There couldn't have been more than 10 or 20 buildings in the whole of the town. The structure they hid behind looked like an overgrown hedge, as if they had taken whatever shrubs they could find and piled them up into some kind of makeshift wall. Most of the branches and brambles still looked green, so couldn't have been older than some weeks. Another arrow did not come, but she could see it drawn on her from the distance. Her first instinct was to turn around in the opposite direction, but held her ground and shouted,
"This Malver Creek?"
The human figures looked at each other, clearly surprised the creature had uttered human speech.
"Not for long,"
one of them called back sarcastically. The bows lowered, but snapped back into position as Salvi dropped her hands and groped about her dress. Where had she put that letter? She eventually found it, wrinkled and edging near illegibility, and raised it above her head.
"Looking for
What was the name?
Diamond."
"Ain't no Drymond here," one yelled back. Then another distant figure mouthed silent words, lost in the distance into the air. He shouted back,
"You mean Raymond?"
Right, that was the name.
"Salvi mean Raymond."
She saw heads shift, sharing glances, and suddenly the barricade seemed to buzz with excitement.
"Come on, quit your gawking and get in there."
As he spoke, even more humans began to appear. She ran across the field, climbed atop the barricade, and let out another squeal of surprise as dozens of grasping hands pulled her over and on to the ground. They surrounded her, grasped and shouted over each other so that it all blended into one cacophonous roar. She shrank and cowered back as the human wave crushed onto her, groping, hands reaching at her. How were there so many humans? Far too many for the size of the village. The original human who had been on the wall suddenly dove in and started pushing back the others, shouting things like, "Out of the way!" and "Let him breathe!" until an empty ring opened up around her. One turned to her, practically beaming with hope and intensity.
"You're bringing him, right?"
Salvi was confused and quite frightened. She stood up and felt the gazes towards her, like a physical force.
You're from the Lord, right?
He asked eagerly. He was a young boy, bright-faced and spirited, but as the silence stretched on, looking onto Salvi's bemused face, the light seemed to slowly drain from his face.
Out of the way! Out of the way!
Someone shouted, pushing his way through the crowd. He forced his way into the circle and looked at the others, then to Salvi.
Raymond!
Said the boy. Raymond examined Salvi with sharp eyes, turned and crooked a beckoning finger towards him. She watched him leave, flinching, then jogged awkwardly as soon as she realized she was supposed to follow him. The crowd parted from him, and now they knew who he was, and dissolved. It wasn't a long walk. The town wasn't very big to begin with. Her head flitted this way or that, examining the strange humans. Those who weren't in the crowd were dragging their feet, or sitting limp like marionettes with their strings cut, utterly aimless and without any light in their eyes. Free of the crowd, he turned to face Salvi. She handed him the letter. He was thin, and though he was old, was the only one in the village whose appearance hadn't been worn down by the rigors of hard country labour. His face was sullen like all the others, but behind it was something like hope, which quickly died as he read the contents of the letter.
I should have known,
he said. Raymond led her into a simple wooden house, unremarkable from the outside, but struck Salvi with such a wall of stench when she stepped inside that even she had to gag and wheeze. Pungent herbs lined the shelves, and dried leaves hung from the rafters. It took Salvi some time to acclimate, but, all things considered, it wasn't anything worse than what she'd experienced back home. Raymond sat at his desk and muttered.
Didn't think I'd need to do this again.
He pulled out an assortment of bottles and tinctures.
Looking for Dr. Kharkov?
He asked disinterestedly as he sparkled moss and some bright petals into the mortar and began to crush them into paste. What was his name? She wasn't sure.
Maybe. Must have been running dry for some months. Figured he'd send something.
He glanced at her, then back at his work.
Someone to fetch it for him.
He poured some pungent liquid into the mortar and kept crushing.
Sorry, but I've been preoccupied worrying about other matters. But...
He glanced at her vacuous expression.
Oh, why am I telling you this?
He poured the mixture into a cloth and swirled the mass into a ball and squeezed it, for all it was worth, over a small earthenware container.
You need to apologize in my place, warning him that this is perhaps the last bottle he'll be getting from me.
The last drop fell into the container, and he corked it shut. Salvi cocked her head. She wasn't really following the conversation. She was too focused on what his hands were doing, but he took the look as quizzical.
Monsters like you, I suppose, but worse. More feral. Wargs. Showed up some months ago, deep in a deep forest. Lost Isha and Smith to them, before we noticed. Good hunters they were. First it was the hunters, then it was the farms. Been getting closer ever since. Packs too nasty. Can't do anything now. Most fled the farms and end up here with nothing to do but wait for next attack. Right outside our doors by now, I reckon. Won't be long now.
He scribbled something onto the bottle with some ink.
All burst down my door first it started. Only one round here who's been outside this village. Only one who can read, sides. Begging me to write to the local lord. I did. Told me to go pound sand. He did. Tax collectors never come here, and we hardly grow enough to feed ourselves. Obviously we ain't worth it, as he sees it. Haven't had the heart to tell the others. So why's they rounded on you the way they did? I'd missed my spirit rise a tad when I heard a messenger had arrived too.
He slid the bottle over to her, and despite his sullen and surly expression, seemed to enjoy having someone to heap all his woes onto. He talked really fast, and it was hard for Salvi to keep up. She thought she understood what he was talking about, but she looked incredulous.
Why not run?
He sighed, accepting it was something she could probably never understand, either from her lifestyle or her race.
Lived our whole lives here. It's all we know. We've got nothing worth selling. Lose our land, lose everything. Only thing out there for poor country people, not much better than slavery. Bunch of proud, free men like this couldn't handle it. Better die trying than run away where life ain't much better than death. Some ran. Don't judge them for it. It's up to them, but I ain't running.
It seemed utterly stupid, but she chalked it up to be one of those human things she would never understand. She went to grab the bottle and found Raymond's hand wrapped around hers.
My payment.
He squinted expectantly. Her jaw hinged open in disbelief.
Salvi no money?
She barked. That stupid healing human hadn't said anything about paying.
Die soon anyway. Why need money?
That bottle you're clutching is about the only thing this town can sell. Takes us weeks to gather all the ingredients and months to prepare them properly. Profits needs to last us a whole year, bring in materials to repair tools and the like. If we don't die, I ain't gonna be the one to explain I gave away our yearly profit to some squat scale-shedding lizard. Especially one claiming to be poor as dirt when they come wearing enough jewelry to buy my home 10 times over.
He was clearly unamused.
Leave one of those rings behind and it's yours.
Human wants Salvi's gold?
She clutched her hand and turned her body away, as if he were about to steal them.
Can't have.
Then you're not getting this.
He took the bottle and slid open a drawer.
Wait!
She exclaimed, and he froze, eyebrowed peaked, as if expecting an apology as well as payment. Salvi grimaced as she grabbed one of her rings and wiggled it off, her face as pained as if she were trying to take off her whole finger. She looked at it mournfully, regretfully. Raymond rolled his eyes. She dropped the ring on the counter and took the container.
If,
she squeaked.
Salvi help? Give back ring? You!
He barked a laugh.
What are you gonna do? Go talk to or something?
He crackled.
Think your monster friends will listen? Maybe? Salvi hate Varg!
She crossed her arms petulantly.
Salvi bring help! If you can save this place, I'll give you this ring and my whole damned house to go along with it.
He could barely contain his laughter. She brightened, and her apparently supreme confidence was enough to make Raymond stop laughing and take a step back as she tucked the bottle into her clothes and walked out the door with purpose in her step. Tybalt looked ahead, looking at nothing in particular as he sat atop his horse. His personal guard surrounded him, and hundreds of soldiers and followers marched on behind. In absence of absolutely anything to do, he was currently lost in thought, remembering a particularly embarrassing moment involving the Countess of Wickersbury, and playing through countless scenarios in which he hadn't made a fool out of himself. He smiled in spite of himself as he conjured up an imaginary scenario in which he had actually managed to snatch the ballistic tray of custard from the air, and the whole room would have burst into laughter and applause, as his retainers exclaimed, "That's Sir Tybalt for you!" He was getting to the part where the serving girls giggled as he handed back the tray with a wink when, "Sir." "Oh, He blinked as he smacked his lips. "What is it, soldier?" He looked down at the man who had suddenly appeared next to him while he was busy building castles in the sky. For some reason, the soldier seemed to wince every time he walked to keep pace with the horse. "The report, sir." "Right." He coughed and repeated more sternly, "Right." He puffed himself up to fit the image of the indomitable Tybalt that he had to maintain. The soldier bored him with his squad's report, and was all he could do to keep awake as he plattered on about how there was nothing to report, and instead took it upon himself to keep him woefully up to date with the latest camp drama. If he had to hear one more story about someone sneaking into the rations and trying to cheat the local horse out of a fistful of coppers, he was going to scream. The soldiers were restless, and he couldn't blame them. Marching through the damp forest and pulpy dirt had done much damage to their morale. They had started to get that fatigued cast to their eyes, and it was decidedly because nothing had happened, and nothing was likely to happen for quite a while, if ever. The scouts were the ones doing the real work. If anyone was going to encounter the two thieves, it would be them. The band he was leading was nothing more than a mobile supply depot, handing out fresh horses and provisions to the scouts as soon as they arrived, only to gallop off just as fast. It wasn't as if you could expect to catch two travelers trawling an entire band behind you. It just wasn't possible. They were apparently approaching a remote village in these mountains. He could let his men loose on it to blow off some steam. It was a legitimate tactic, but unlike his father, he simply found such things to be unconscionable. Though they might try and do it regardless if morale fell too low, most of the roving bandit bands were simply ex-soldiers left over after command had broken down. His soldiers were disciplined. They were all accomplished soldiers from Pharaoh's own guard, not some rough tumble peasant with 2 weeks of training to be professional arrow fodder. But he wished he could ignore these reports altogether. But according to the scouts, the trail they had been following all this time passed directly through their camp more than once. It was unthinkable, but that was simply the query they were dealing with. He drew his lips into a line, grumbled, and resigned to take camp drama a little more seriously. The soldier finished his report. Tybalt relaxed and was about to slip back into his so rudely interrupted fantasies when the soldier surprised him by continuing to talk. "Sir, if I could ask a question." "What?" "If you could tell us more about what we were supposed to be looking for. It would be much easier to keep watch if we had more information." He was obviously curious. Tybalt let out a heavy sigh. "What's your name, soldier?" "Braum, sir." He saluted. "Leader of Tent 9. Tybalt pinned him with a scrutinizing gaze. If he was a tent leader, he was probably trustworthy, and Tybalt considered himself a good judge of character. So it was... Oh, what did it matter at this point? If he was an intelligentsia, it wasn't like he was going to learn anything he didn't already know. "We're chasing 2 people, a human and a kobold. They broke into Pharaoh's castle and stole something important. They might be part of a larger band, which is why we are bringing so many soldiers with us. Does that answer your questions?" Braum looked unsurprised, like it wasn't anything different from what he had heard from camp gossip. "What do they look like?" "The human is about as tall as you. He's got brown skin and white eyes. He was wearing a cloak, so no one knows what his face looks like, but that should be enough information." "And the kobold?" No one saw it clearly enough. They had interrogated some people who had seen it in town, but the descriptions were so varied as to be nearly useless. "All we know for sure is that it was a kobold. They're not common around these parts, so that should be enough." An indecipherable expression mixed with something between guilt and amusement suddenly flashed across his face. "Isn't there anything to tell them apart from other kobolds? You know, just in case we find another one and just assume it is the one we are looking for." He sighed. What was the point in keeping it secret anyway? "If they are the one we are looking for, likely they will be in possession of an amulet. One that looks like it's been broken in half." The soldier suddenly stopped and fell behind the constantly walking horse. Good, Tybalt thought. He finally got tired of asking questions. The horse walked on, and his previous reverie about custard made him start thinking about how much he wanted some right now. He was in the midst of imagining how it feels to catch the thieves and returning home triumphantly to custard, when suddenly he saw a village ahead. He squinted hard. Were they all carrying weapons? There were at least 100 people outside the insignificant town, brandishing them as if they were meant to die where they stood. Had the village mistaken them for a roving bandit group? But the villagers were behind some kind of makeshift barricade, and he couldn't have built that in such a short notice, unless they had seen one of the scouts and assumed such a thing, but the chances of that were... All his speculated was sliced off as a howling call of clarion pierced his ears. He drew his sword in a flash and leaned forwards, expecting to see the peasants charging at them, until he heard the screams coming from behind. He yanked his reins. The horse reared and turned, galloping towards the cries of his men, twixt snarling and snapping of two large teeth. "Wargs!" someone cried amidst the shouts, and all hell broke loose.
"I still don't see why you had to drag me all the way out here,"
moaned Brandalkoff.
"Don't you think I might be a little tired after, I don't know, nearly dying?" "Brandalkoff sleep days. How still tired?"
He pouted, tilting his chin. He played with his moustache, prime and freshly waxed. His clothes were all new, and across his back laid his trusty lute, though after all the repairs, it was unlikely much of the original still remained. Spending the week in bed had given him plenty of time to order the replacements. His strut was twice as ostentatious as it had been, as if he was absorbing the flamboyant energy directly from the fresh clothing. He was just happy to be looking proper.
"Must say, as dreadfully odorous as it was, that medicine really worked."
He gripped his shoulder, twirled his arm as if warming up for a pitch.
"Must be because I nearly died."
He made sure to emphasize it, and could be forgiven for the overstatement, considering the intelligence of his companion.
"But I haven't felt this good in a long time."
She had told him she needed his help getting back her ring from the Raymond fellow, who had given her the medicine, apparently demanding it as collateral. He wasn't really sure what she meant by help, but she said he was the smartest person she knew, and was certain he could come up with something. And he supposed he owed her after she had trekked days to some god-forsaken village just to get him some medicine.
"Anyway,"
he pulled out his lute. Salvi winced preemptively.
"I've had this tune stuck in my head ever since we got out of that unpleasantness. It had been up there since I woke up, and I can't stop thinking about it. I think this is a sound my music has been lacking all this time. It's like God whispered it into my ear. Must have met him when I nearly died, and simply forgot. Pity.
He brandished it, and Salvi thought he looked more menacing with the instrument than most executioners.
Tell me what you think.
His cheerful tone could not prepare her for the mind-melting cacophony that erupted from the instrument like physical force. It was almost unthinkable that the instrument could even produce such horrid noise, and even more surmising that it seemed to have a tune. Indeed, it had a tune. It was a tune that scraped her brain, poked and prodded its hidden creases, until something big and black emerged. She wanted to grip her head and scream, but her arms would not obey her. It filled her with ineffable fear, but she did not know why. Her eyes were wide, trapped in a foreign body, when... plonk!
No, that's not quite right,
Brandlecoff murmured as he struck a sour chord. The scream trapped in Salvi's throat escaped, and Brandlecoff jumped back, staring in surprise as she panted heavily. Salvi blinked, paused, and shouted,
No music!
Brandlecoff rolled his eyes and sighed at what was apparently her lesser intelligence, and put the lute away. What had she been so afraid of? She could not remember. It was probably Brandlecoff's music, but it sounded much better than she remembered. She almost liked it. The thought alone was enough to horrify her. They continued ahead in pointed silence until Salvi began sniffing around.
Get close,
She said, showing her navigation prowess by uttering it while the village was already in plain view.
Why does it smell like iron?
Brandlecoff asked as they approached, and was generally unimpressed.
I suppose this is where the people who the commoners might think of as commoners live.
Someone moved from behind the barricade, taking what looked like a leisurely stroll, until he looked Brandlecoff's way and pointed in astonishment. Must not get visitors often, Brandlecoff thought wearily, and gawked as a stampede of people suddenly burst out, flowing over the barricade and barreling straight towards them.
Heavens above, we're going to be robbed!
Was the only thing he could think up to explain the catching horde. He fumbled for his knife with shaky hands and dropped it in the dirt. He let out a squeal like a distressed rodent and dove into the grass, searching for it. But the crowd was already upon them, cheering. He looked up, scanning the sea of faces. Salvi had already been absorbed into the crowd and hurled into the air celebratorily as she waved flailing limbs, just to be caught and tossed up again.
You were gonna bring him?
He heard from within the din. They were all just looking at him.
Hey, Carol, you think he oughta be one of them nobles?
One asked excitedly, obviously referring to Branelkoff's clothes. Though, if they had ever seen a jester in their lives, that certainly would have been their first guess. Branelkoff gasped and placed a flattened hand on his chest.
I'm surprised you could tell.
They whooped and cheered, and would have given him the same treatment Salvi was currently enduring, if not for the fear of angering him.
Huzzah on that, sent fighting folk!
Another cried. Branelkoff suddenly looked very confused.
Thank you so much.
A middle-aged woman grovelled at his feet, and all the others joined in, singing his praise as they cried their gratitude. An old man with skin like raisin wiped away his tears from his eyes.
Thank ye for sending your army to some no-name village like us. Thank ye. Thank ye.
Now he was even more confused, but if Branelkoff knew one thing, it was how not to spoil the mood.
Yes, you're welcome.
He flashed a winning smile.
If only your men stuck around long enough for us to thank 'em rightly. But 'fraid we don't got enough cuts to bed an army.
The old man laughed.
Yes, yes,
Branelkoff said dismissively. Their gratitude was overwhelming, and having so many peasants in his face was making him uncomfortable.
Would you like to listen to some of my music? It's a piece I've been working on, but if I have such a captive audience...
He twisted his moustache. The peasants looked at each other, then back to him, eyes blazing with excitement. For people who had heard proper music once, perhaps twice in their lives as the odd travelling gentleman had appeared in town, to not only hear music, but from their saviour himself, seemed like a gift sent from heaven. He took out his lute and played, raping their ears with his catonic melodies. They danced in glee, though they did not know why, only assuming after the fact that this was what real music sounded like. Obvious as it seemed, for how could they both love and despise something at the same time? However, the words to describe exactly why they found the melody so addictive felt slippery as butter. Salvi plugged her ears.